I do think we've seen George become perhaps a little less reserved, a little bit more outgoing, and certainly thriving. He's really going to come into his own, and he seems to enjoy being in the public spotlight far more than he used to.
When a sharp-tongued school professor tried to single out Prince George in front of the class, expecting an easy win, he had no idea he was about to be outsmarted royally. What started as a smug attempt to embarrass the young royal quickly turned into a jaw-dropping moment no one saw coming.
The most important thing for them, I know, is family and their children, and giving their children as ordinary a possible life as they can for royal children.
Prince George, calm and collected, unleashed a mind-blowing math answer that left the room stunned. This wasn't just a clever comeback. It was a quiet flex of brilliance that proved royalty runs deeper than titles and crowns. The day a professor tried to outsmart Prince George, the Grand Assembly Hall of Rosebridge Academy was alive with excitement. The buzz of voices, the rustle of uniforms, and the tapping of eager feet against the polished wooden floors echoed through the space. Rows of students, some whispering predictions, and others craning their necks for a better view, filled every seat. Today wasn't just another school day. It was part of a prestigious program the school had proudly launched, where top minds from universities across the country were invited to teach advanced topics to the school's brightest students. It was designed to challenge them, to expose them to complex subjects far beyond their years. And this morning that subject was calculus. The idea of a university-level lesson had stirred curiosity in every corner of the school. Most students had only heard of calculus in passing, something whispered in awe by older siblings, or seen scribbled in confusing equations on the pages of advanced textbooks. For them, it was abstract, distant, and perhaps even a little intimidating. But for one boy sitting calmly in the second row, it was different. Prince George, dressed in his standard navy blazer and neatly knotted tie, appeared relaxed, hands folded on his desk, eyes fixed on the front of the hall. Mathematics had always intrigued him. He didn't show off about it, never had. But numbers, patterns, logic, they made sense to him in a way that few other things did. However, not everyone in the hall shared that sense of calm. The one person who should have been the most composed, the guest lecturer himself, was far from it. Professor Albert Wainwright, a towering man known for both his academic excellence and icy disposition, was already waiting just outside the doors. A mathematician from Oxford, he was revered for his work in theoretical mathematics and equally known for his sharp tongue and disdain for spoon-feeding students. He valued intellect above all else and had little patience for what he saw as distractions, titles, wealth, or reputations. So, when he was informed that one of his students today would be none other than Prince George, his demeanor shifted. This wasn't just a lecture anymore. It was, in his mind, an opportunity, a chance to prove that intelligence could not be inherited with a crown or bought with privilege. He didn't just plan to teach calculus. He intended to use it as a tool to humble royalty. At precisely 10 o'clock, the heavy double doors creaked open and Professor Wainwright stepped inside. Dressed in an old-fashioned tweed suit with worn elbow patches and clutching a weathered leather briefcase, he looked exactly like the stereotype of an aging scholar. A hush swept over the hall. His shoes clicked against the polished floor as he approached the front, eyes scanning the room with precision. He paused when his gaze found George. Recognition flickered. Then came the smile. It wasn't warm. It was the kind that hinted at a private joke. George recognized it instantly. He was being targeted. "Good morning, students," Wainwright said, his voice calm but brimming with condescension. "Today I will attempt what many deem impossible, introducing calculus to young minds, a field so advanced even adults tremble at its name." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the crowd. He clasped his hands behind his back. "You see, mathematics is the great equalizer. It cares nothing for bloodlines or bank accounts. Only intellect." George's expression didn't change, but inside, he was alert. The professor's words were carefully chosen, polished and pointed. That last line about titles and intellect wasn't said for the room. It was said for him. His instincts, sharpened by years of public appearances and subtle court dynamics, picked up on the professor's intent. This was not going to be a friendly lesson. Without warning, Wainwright turned to the chalkboard and, in sweeping, confident strokes, scribbled out a dense differentiation equation. The symbols sprawled across the slate like a foreign language to most of the students. "Since we have royalty among us," he said smoothly, stepping aside, "perhaps His Royal Highness would honor us by solving this." Silence. You could hear the clock ticking at the back of the room. Students exchanged glances. This wasn't how guest lectures went. Normally, professors guided them gently through topics, pausing to explain difficult terms. But this was a public challenge, a trap laid out under the soft disguise of academic rigor. Some students looked toward George with wide eyes. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure of how to react. Was this meant to be a joke? But George didn't hesitate. He stood up, adjusted his blazer, and walked toward the board with the same calm grace he'd shown during state visits and formal events. "Of course, sir," he replied with quiet politeness. Wainwright folded his arms, stepping back to watch. His smirk widened. This was it. He'd seen grown adults fail this problem. There was no way an 11-year-old could even understand it, let alone solve it. This was going to be his moment. The moment he exposed the gap between birthright and brilliance. He imagined the confusion on the boy's face, the stammering, the awkward retreat. It would prove his point. Not all students are created equal, no matter how blue their blood. But George didn't falter. He studied the equation, scanning it the way one might study a puzzle or a pattern in nature. It was complex, yes, but not unfamiliar. He'd seen variations of it before. His father, Prince William, had always stressed the importance of being more than just a title. His mother, Princess Catherine, had encouraged his love for learning and supported his interests. Tutors had guided him, sure, but George had put in the work. And calculus, though rare for his age, was something he genuinely enjoyed exploring. He picked up the chalk. And now, first calculus question. Is the prince actually capable of withstanding such test? Let's move on to find out. Prince George silences the room with one brilliant solution. Mathematics, for Prince George, was never just about solving equations or memorizing formulas. To him, it was like a secret language, full of rhythm, patterns, and quiet logic. It helped him understand how things worked, how one step led to the next, and how even the most complex puzzles had a solution if you looked at them the right way. While many of his classmates struggled or complained about the subject, George had always found comfort in its clarity. He never boasted about his skills. Very few people knew just how good he was. But someone had taken notice. His latest school report had described him as a mathematical prodigy, words his teacher hadn't used lightly. That praise didn't make George arrogant. If anything, it made him more focused, more eager to learn, more driven to live up to that potential. Now, standing in front of the board, chalk in hand, George felt all eyes on him. The air was thick with anticipation. The complicated calculus problem Professor Wainwright had written still glared down at him like a challenge carved in stone. For the briefest moment, George paused, a single heartbeat. It wasn't fear, it was focus. But that flicker of hesitation was all the professor needed to smirk, his lips curling with thinly veiled satisfaction. "Go on then," he said, his voice cold and condescending. "Show us where you'd begin." It wasn't an invitation. It was a trap. Wainwright didn't want George to succeed. He wanted the prince to fumble, to freeze up under pressure, to confirm every doubt he had about royalty and intelligence. To him, this moment was a step toward proving his belief that titles didn't come with talent. But George wasn't easily shaken. He knew what was happening. He didn't snap back or argue. Instead, he calmly turned to the board and began to work. Step by step, each movement was deliberate, precise. His handwriting was clear. His thought process was flawless. Symbols appeared like brushstrokes on a canvas, the once intimidating problem slowly unraveling under his fingers. The room, moments ago filled with whispers and shifting bodies, had gone completely silent. Even the usually restless students in the back rows were motionless, eyes fixed on the unfolding scene. Wainwright, arms folded, watched with increasing tension. For a second, something flickered across his face. Was it disbelief? Frustration? Maybe both. This wasn't the script he had prepared in his mind. He had assumed George would stumble, that the boy would stall or look helplessly at the board. But instead, he was watching something that shouldn't have been possible. An 11-year-old not just attempting, but mastering, an equation his university students often struggled with. And then it happened. George placed the final symbol, boxed the answer, and took a step back. He didn't look smug. He didn't even smile. He simply checked his work once more, calmly placed the chalk down, and waited. Not for applause, just for a reaction. But none came. The silence felt like a weight pressing on the room. George glanced at the professor, who was now frozen in place, scanning the board over and over again as if hoping to find even the smallest error. But there was none. The solution was perfect. For the first time that day, doubt crept into George's mind. Had he missed something? Was there a trick hidden in the problem? He waited for the professor to pounce on a mistake, but nothing happened. Wainwright blinked. Once, twice. Still silent. And then, someone in the room whispered, "Did he just solve that?" I didn't even understand where to start. The professor cleared his throat, almost startled by the voice. "You," he began, his voice suddenly unsure. "You've seen this type of problem before?" There it was, the assumption that George had been specially tutored, given answers, that his success must have come from privilege, not effort. But George calmly shook his head. "No, sir." A fresh wave of whispers rippled across the hall. No one could explain what they'd just witnessed. Wainwright fought to mask his reaction, but the tension in his jaw gave him away. He had tried to outwit the boy, set a trap that George was supposed to walk right into. But instead, he'd been the one caught off guard. There was no denying it now. Prince George wasn't just clever. He was brilliant. The professor shifted on his feet, adjusting his jacket with forced composure. "A lucky attempt," he said briskly, but his tone lacked conviction. Something had changed. This wasn't going the way he'd planned. The lesson they didn't see coming. Just when the classroom couldn't feel more tense, the door creaked open again. All eyes turned, and in walked the last person anyone expected, the head of the mathematics department, known for his brilliance and unflinching instincts. For the first time that morning, Professor Wainwright's confidence faltered. He hadn't planned for this visitor. George stood calmly by the board, chalk in hand, while the department head's gaze locked onto the solution George had just finished. He stared at it, frowning, not in disapproval but deep focus. A long pause followed. Then came the unmistakable glint of shock in his eyes. Wainwright stiffened. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. His plan to publicly expose George as an overprivileged student had crumbled. George hadn't just solved the problem, he'd mastered it. "Where did you learn to do this?" the department head asked, eyes still fixed on the board. George gave a modest shrug and a slight smile. Here and there. Wainwright turned pale. He'd taught hundreds of students, some gifted, some even prodigies, but never had a response floored him like this. George stepped aside to let the department head get a better look. The solution wasn't just correct, it was elegant, sharp, as if the student hadn't just played by the rules, but rewritten them. The department head glanced at Wainwright. "Is this your problem?" "Yes," Wainwright said stiffly. "I gave it to him as part of an assessment." The tone had shifted. This wasn't about dominance anymore. The battle had become a quiet acknowledgement of genius. The department head turned back to George. "Have you entered any competitions? Olympiads? Research?" George shook his head. I just enjoy numbers." Whispers rippled through the class. The quiet kid who never raised his hand was now center stage, praised by the most respected academic in the school. Wainwright, however, wasn't ready to give in. "You expect us to believe you've reached this level without special training?" he asked, his tone edging back into skepticism. George smiled again, unbothered. "I don't expect you to believe anything. But it's true." That line hit harder than any boast. Wainwright's lips tightened. He wasn't ready to lose. "Very well," he said, grabbing fresh chalk. "Let's try something more abstract." He scribbled a new problem, this time deep number theory. It wasn't just hard, it was obscure. A trap designed to dismantle George's logic and expose the earlier success as luck. The room tensed. Students leaned in. George studied the board. He didn't rush, didn't write, just stood silently, head tilted slightly. Was this the moment he'd finally falter? Then George moved. Slowly, thoughtfully. His writing was more deliberate than before, each line unfolding with precision. He wasn't just solving a problem, he was reconstructing it, building new paths through layers of logic most wouldn't even see. Wainwright watched, stunned. This wasn't memorized material. This was pure, creative thought. George paused once, tapping the chalk, then finished the solution with a light flourish. Turning back to the class, he smiled. That should do it. Wainwright approached the board like a man walking into a storm. He scanned every part, hunting for a flaw. But there were none. The department head let out a soft, incredulous laugh. "This level of insight, I've only seen it a few times in my entire career." Wainwright said nothing. He didn't need to. His silence spoke volumes. As the room began to relax, the head of the department turned to George and smiled. Then came the final question that left the professor speechless. But would George be cleverer than the very brain behind it? Wait and see. What happens next is incredible. A lesson in genius. Professor Wainwright wasn't one to be easily impressed, but something about George's confidence rattled him. Determined not to let a student, let alone a royal one, get the upper hand again, he turned sharply to the board for the last time. With a firm hand, he scribbled down a new equation, one far more complicated than the last. It involved implicit differentiation and second-order derivatives. A problem so complex, even his senior calculus students often stumbled over it. He stepped aside, arms crossed, convinced this would be the moment the prince would finally falter. But George, calm and curious, simply studied the problem. A spark lit his eyes, and a small smile curled his lips. "Interesting," he muttered, as though someone had handed him a new riddle to enjoy over tea. To most people, this equation would feel like trying to decode a foreign language underwater. But for George, it was a thrill, a challenge he was eager to dive into. Without pause, he picked up the chalk and went to work. This time, his hand moved with more urgency, precise yet fast. His logic was razor-sharp, breaking down the question into manageable steps like he was solving a puzzle he'd already seen the answer to. He moved through the math fluidly, leaving behind a trail of neat numbers and clear strategy. A collective gasp echoed from the class. One student whispered, "No way." He's a math genius. Heads turned, mouths hung open. Professor Wainwright felt a flush of heat crawl up his neck. This wasn't what he had planned. He had walked into that classroom ready to make an example out of the young prince. He had scoffed at the idea of teaching calculus to kids, seeing it as a waste of intellect and time. The only reason he'd agreed to this visit was the petty thrill of catching the prince off guard. But now, it was he who had been caught, off balance, off guard, and off his high horse. Beads of sweat gathered on his forehead as he stared at George in disbelief. Not only had the boy solved the first problem with stunning clarity, but he had breezed through an even more advanced one like it was child's play. Prince George wasn't just smart, he was extraordinary. Wainwright had severely misjudged him, and the realization wasn't just embarrassing, it was humbling. And to think, the boy had done all this without any special coaching or private tutoring. The professor let out a sigh, his pride slowly deflating. "I suppose I owe you an apology," he said at last, his voice quieter, softer. "I underestimated you. Your Royal Highness." George, ever composed and kind, offered a gracious nod. "That's all right, sir. I understand why you did." A ripple of laughter passed through the classroom. The tension broke like a popped balloon, and for the first time Professor Wainwright smiled. Not out of smugness, but respect. Try as he might, he couldn't dislike the boy. There was no arrogance in George, only calm brilliance and a touch of humor. He wasn't just talented, he was likable too. From that moment on, something shifted in the room. Wainwright's entire approach softened. He stopped lecturing and started engaging. He asked questions, encouraged ideas, and even made the occasional joke. The class, which had once felt like a battlefield, became a space where curiosity was welcomed and celebrated. Even students who usually dreaded math found themselves leaning forward, interested. By the time the bell rang, signaling the end of the lesson, something remarkable happened. The students applauded, loudly. That had never happened in one of Wainwright's lectures before. As he gathered his notes, Wainwright turned to George one last time. "I suspect you'll do great things one day." George smiled. "I'll try my best, sir." He walked back to his seat, classmates still watching him in silent awe. They had all witnessed something incredible that day. And Professor Wainwright? He walked out of Lamrook not just with a changed opinion, but with a whole new understanding of what brilliance looked like. Have you ever encountered such a teacher before? And why do you think Professor Wainwright was so tough on Prince George? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe.